are prepared to adjust our assistance posture towards that government. So we're ready to go.
Well, I was describing if they formed a government without the opposition.
The
military.
Without the opposition.
Right.
So we will work with
What will we do? What will our response be?
So we will certainly work with our colleagues at the State Department to make a political analysis as to whether or not this is a government in which we can work. But in the event that we can work them, we're ready to go.
I think that was referring that to you, Ambassador.
Chair, I would like to just be very clear and unequivocal about this. We have conveyed in very strong terms that a unilateral government formed by the TMC would not be credible, would be unacceptable, and we would have a very difficult time engaging with such a government.
What do you think the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt would do?
Well, we've had frank discussions, as I said, this last week, as well as the previous contacts I've described, and they have said to us repeatedly, they too want to see a civilian-led government that is in their interest because they are fundamentally concerned about stability. Anything short of a civilian-led transitional government that has the consensus and the buy-in from the people will not provide the stability that they care about. So we believe them, we take them at their word that they want to see that they are sending those similar kinds of messages, and we urge them to continue to do that publicly, privately, and to use their leverage.
So are we doing anything to return internet access? I don't believe the internet is back, is it?
My understanding is that it's not back yet. We're very concerned about that. Of course, it affects not only messaging, but it also affects humanitarian assistance delivery. It affects a number of things.
Right.
We're very concerned about that. We have, again, been making that one of our clear messages to the TMC. You have to restore the internet.
So what are we doing to support then the human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society during this period? And when you say to them that they have to restore the internet, what is their response? Because they haven't done it.
Well, they have not done it. I couldn't tell you chapter and verse as to what they are doing behind the scenes. We haven't seen it, but they know that it's part of our broader messaging. If you do not allow the people to demonstrate peacefully, if you do not allow not just the internet, but media freedom, that all of this undermines credibility in the efforts to get a civilian government. We've been making the linkage that you cannot have a good faith process if you don't allow the people to be speaking and to be seen and to be able to demonstrate peacefully. So we've been simply reiterating this as part of our broader messaging to them that people have a right to peacefully protest.
Do you get a sense that they take us seriously? I mean, we don't have an ambassador, right?
We have a charge, and that's because they have a charge here. But our charge, Stephen Kudus, has been very engaged. He has regular meetings across the board with FFC and TMC and other stakeholders. So we think that we're getting our message across. We've actually seen some moderation. When I arrived in Khartoum in early April, one of the first demands was that the negotiators that the TMC had put forward were not credible. They were considered tainted, and we pressed that they had to remove them. The TMC did remove those people. And so we think that they do begin to hear us, but it's a consistent and it has to be a collective message from the broader international community.
So it just seems to me, I mean, you know, I was there a few months ago before this happened, and they were so excited and interested in moving U.S. relations forward, and they were all ears, and to me it seems like that has closed. I don't get the impression that they are taking us seriously. If we have said over and over again they need to restore internet access, and they haven't, I don't know if we have any ability technology-wise to supersede that.
I couldn't answer on the technical issue of what we can do on the internet specifically, other than make it very clear that that is part of our broader demand for giving the public access to media and the ability to be heard and to be seen. In terms of our leverage, one of the most important bits of leverage we have, and I think the committee is quite aware, is that we were in discussions with the government prior to the fall of Bashir. We were in discussions under what we call Phase 2. That process has been suspended indefinitely. Right. The government is very much interested in resuming that because they see it as the ultimate path to getting to economic assistance.
Right.
And so that leverage is something that
they want the state sponsor of terrorism removed.
We are continuing to press that there will not even be a reassessment of starting that dialogue unless the civilian government is in place. So we think we have their attention because that's leverage that they really want us to exert in their behalf.
Thank you.
Thank you much, Madam Chair. Let me ask you, if I could, the makeup of the RSF. You know, the information I've looked at suggests that there may be as many as 50,000 troops. A man who goes by the name or the nickname of Hamedi, who is well known for his atrocities, and I'm wondering what we know about him. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how the Saudis and the Gulf states provide money. What is the flow of money, munitions, other material? Do they have any influence to try to end this reign of terror, since they seem to be the purse strings? But again, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, I mean, could be misstated, who goes by the nickname of Hamedi. But 50,000 troops, is that accurate? Because that is a huge force. And are they at loggerheads with the military, or are they in some way in cahoots with the military? If you could speak to that as well. Who in the RSF has been who are they targeting? I mean, when they went into the hospitals, when they raped men and women, when they killed people, what was their target? They must have had, it couldn't have been indiscriminate. They must have had people. Is there any sectarian violence involved here? Other Muslims, for example, or Catholics or others? Is there any evidence of that? I think that is important. And again, the Janjaweed leadership, how many of these people are newly recruited into this new force? You know, the Janjaweed was notorious for its brutality. They never went away, and apparently they have reconstituted themselves under a new banner. If you could speak to that as well.
Let me start with Hamedi first. Hamedi is the deputy of the TMC. And in that position, he has a role of influence within the TMC structure. And so we engage with him, not to confer legitimacy, not because we believe that he is somebody who is a credible and a good leader, but because we have to engage with him to deliver our tough messages. So we do meet with him quite regularly as part of our engagement strategy to be sure that they are getting our messages loud and clear. With respect to the RSF, I couldn't answer your question yet on the numbers, but we all know the RSF are a remnant of the, they are a rebranded version of what was the Janjaweed. These are not people who we consider to be credible security forces, but we do feel like because they have been a part of the security force, the TMC has to rein them in and has to direct their behavior and has to be accountable for their behavior. But the RSF is quite a concern for us, very, very big concern. These are not disciplined forces, these are not trained security, and there is a great concern that the division between them and the regular army, the Sudanese armed forces, is very worrisome. Nobody wants to see a civil war break out, and so we're trying to convey to General Burhan, who is the head of the TMC, that he must be accountable for what is happening with Hamedi and the RSF. We cannot say that enough. And it's not just the United States. This is a point that all the countries involved in Sudan, including the members who were at the meetings on the weekend, the Gulf states, Egypt, Ethiopia, the AU, we've all been sending a similar message. The RSF must be reined in. They have the potential to destabilize what could be a successful transitional process, because they, of course, are worried about their future. So we've been repeating that message over and over to Burhan. He has to be accountable for what is happening with Hamedi and the RSF.
Is there any kind of graph that would show the line of authority with Hamedi and others, and how many of these commanders are seasoned Janjaweed who have committed the most gross atrocities on the face of the earth, and now they're unleashed again to kill fellow Sudanese? Do we have that? I mean, what is the core group that really makes up this terrible organization?
I don't have a definitive number for you today. We can do some checking on that. But I think it's accurate to say that they are widely dispersed throughout Khartoum.
Right.
They're in Omdurman, they're in other large cities. So they are in many different places. And we have urged that they be removed from the streets of Khartoum. They have no business in Khartoum. There are no barracks for them in Khartoum. And if they're going to be removed off the streets, they have to be totally decommissioned there. There's no place for them to go back into barracks in the Khartoum area.
Now, you've testified that AU has suspended their membership. Does that have any real impact? I mean, Bashir actually ran the organization during one cycle, and I'm just wondering if what else is on the table that could really impact them?
The point I was trying to underscore earlier about the robust diplomacy that's happening now, we're at a new moment right now. Between the envoy that the AU has assigned, the envoy from IGAD and from Ethiopia, and our own envoy, as well as the envoy from the United Nations and others, we see that there is now a consensus coming together. There is a core of diplomacy that's really beginning to have an impact. We're not only doing it in Khartoum, we're doing it in various other capitals, as well as in the Gulf states. Ambassador Booth will be traveling not only from Addis to Khartoum. He'll be going to the Gulf states this week coming. And so we're going to continue sending the message that we need to be coordinated and using all of our leverage. No one country alone can move this situation. It's going to take our collective activities, which is why we're spending a lot of time coordinating with our partners in any country that has influence and a constructive role to be played. So that's what's been happening. That's the real leverage. Using the diplomacy first because things are beginning to have a dent. You've got the FFC open to an idea that's been put forward from the African Union and the IGAD members, and that's something that we want to build on. We want to lock in what they've already agreed to and keep building on that and pressing the TMC to come to the table. It's not going to be an overnight process, but we have to keep the pressure up from all the different bits of leverage that we have. And many different members of the international community have different degrees of leverage. We're trying to bring it all together.
Thank you. Representative Omar.
Ambassador James, I wanted to talk to you about the role of foreign influence in the events of June 3rd. Particularly wanted to talk to you about Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arabs. I know that the administration sees the importance of engaging the Gulf states since David Hale called both the Saudis and the Emirates after the attacks. What do you think are the interests of Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt's objectives and interests in Sudan?
Well, the first thing I would say is that after the June 3rd violence, the UAE and Saudi government both issued statements, as well as Egypt and others, strongly condemning the violence. They took that action immediately, unprompted, and I take that to mean that they were shocked and appalled by the violence as we were. So I would give them some degree of recognizing that that was a horrific experience. It undermined the process that was going along, we thought, in a constructive way. With respect to their interests, I would say that certainly they have a lot of long-term economic interests, but they also have an interest in fundamental stability. Any instability in Sudan is going to affect the whole region. They have raised that with us on several occasions. We take that to be a very serious concern. Instability in the region is something that's going to affect all the neighbors, and they have a stake in making sure that that instability does not spill over.
And Ambassador, do you think they have interest in democratization of Sudan? And do you know if Secretary Pompeo discussed Sudan with MPS in his meeting yesterday?
I do not have a readout on the Secretary's conversation, so I could not address that. But I would say they have the Gulf states have the same interest we have in terms of stability. And the best way to get that stability is to have the civilian-led government. They have said that repeatedly. They support that. They have made it very clear that they do not support the TMC. They are not there for the TMC, but they engage with the TMC the way we engage to deliver tough messages. I take them at their word that instability cannot be addressed if you don't have a government that the people fundamentally will accept. That's why the civilian-led government has been all of our mantra. That's all the people are demanding. That's what the people want. They understand that's the route to stability.
And we know that the Saudis and the Emirates have had a history of crushing democratic uprising in the region. And so I'm wondering that is contrary to what our interests are or what we see as stability being driven by in the Middle East. How is Ambassador Booth going to bring them around to see things from our point of view?
Well, I start with the fact that I don't think we're pushing on such a closed door to begin with, because in the meetings I held just this weekend with senior officials, the basic message was that we all are in agreement. The civilian-led transitional government is imperative. It's imperative for the stability, but it's also the key to unlocking future economic assistance. That's what the country fundamentally needs. The instability in Sudan was driven by the economic crisis. They want to see the economic crisis addressed. We cannot address it until the state sponsors the terrorism issue is addressed. So stability is key for all of us. I think the Gulf states have that same interest. We're all moving in the direction of what will it take to get us there. That means we have to get a mediated process, which everybody will agree to, that will lead to a civilian government. I think the Emiratis, the Saudis are in the same position we are and wanting to see that happen sooner than later. It's the only guarantee to stave off the instability.
Yeah, and I know that the people of Sudan have fought really hard to make sure that they can get rid of a dictator, and I hope we do everything to make sure that they don't get a dictator for another 30 years. As you've mentioned that there might be possible sanctions down the road, to clarify, do you mean the global Magnitsky sanctions on Hamidi for his role on the June 3rd or something else?
Well, respectfully, I'd like to say that we haven't really finished that review process yet. We're looking at the options, but the options would include a range of things. As I said, there are some incentives, but there are also some sanctions. Everything from visa sanctions to economic sanctions. I think I would leave it in that broad category for now as we're still assessing what are the best tools. We want to use the right tool, and we really want to target the right people. So visa sanctions are certainly on the table, as are economic sanctions.
Mm-hmm. We often see different ways that we engage in the ways that we use our toolboxes. There are a lot of people who are talking to me about the way that we've engaged aggressively in the situation in Venezuela and how we are not engaging aggressively in the case of Sudan. And some people would say this is a country of brown people who are Muslim. We might not be interested in engaging aggressively because our allies don't want us to. And I hope that we are trying to find a balance and trying to be consistent with our values as we engage diplomatically in this particular issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Phillips?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And of course, today's conversation and hearing is not just about the future of Sudan and the Sudanese people, but also Ethiopia, which of course is host to hundreds of thousands of refugees, and even an issue that touches my district in the suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where one of the first questions asked in my recent town hall just last weekend was from a Sudanese immigrant who asked what we are doing to help the transition to an accountable form of government in his former country. So to that end, I can't help but reflect on the fact that we do not have an ambassador representing our country right now. Personnel at our embassy has been drawn down, and the UN is also drawing down personnel. So my first question to both of you is, under those circumstances, are we positioned to provide the assistance and support necessary, and how do those three things affect our ability to do so? Ambassador James.
Yes, sir. With respect to the order of departure, our first priority always at all of our embassies overseas is the safety of our own people and those who work for us. Drawing down the embassy was a prudent measure to take in the early days, partly because the air travel was inconsistent. We would have no way to evacuate people, so we took an action based on the safety of our own people to draw down to just the essential core staff. The essential core staff that was working around the clock, and we're now trying to support them as hard as we can back in Washington. Ambassador Booth's appointment is to help with some of the regional diplomacy. So we do think that we've got a number of tools, the envoy, the embassy team, and then the robust group that we have back here in Washington. So we do think our work is still going forward. Yes, we'd like to be at full staffing, but the most important thing is the safety of the people who are there. We think we're at a reasonable number for the risk and for the work that we have to get done. So that's with respect to the order of departure.
Mr. Day?
I would only add that I think we are well positioned in the event that there is a real political transition in Sudan. We have been working in Sudan for nearly 3 decades. We're the largest humanitarian donor. Our development assistance is quite limited, but at the same time, we do have a pretty significant network of civil society organizations that we've supported over the last several decades. We have made available some money through our elections and political processes fund, and we also are supporting human rights monitoring. So at this point, we feel like our assistance is probably appropriate for what the environment would allow. Again, separating humanitarian assistance and development assistance. But in the event that there is a political transition, we stand at the ready to adjust our assistance posture.
Okay, I appreciate that. My next question is about stolen assets and money laundering. Do you believe those issues are issues in Sudan?
I would have to say they absolutely are issues. We have not personally had the luxury of engaging on those deeply since April 11th, but we know that the FFC has been looking at the issue, and we've urged them to be transparent in whatever work that they're doing around that issue. But it's certainly something that a civilian-led government could take on. I think we're not going to get a lot of traction on that right now, but if we can get to a civilian-led government, I think it's something that we would urge them to put on their agenda.
As you know, the Treasury Department issues anti-money laundering advisories. On occasion, we've done so relative to Venezuela and Ukraine. Would you argue that we should be doing so with Sudan so that we can identify and track some of those assets?
To be quite honest, the priority right now is to really get the political process moving forward, to get the civilian-led government. That's the first thing. When that happens and we've got a responsible government in place, then we can do a lot of other things along the lines you're describing. But without a responsible government, I think it's just going to be so much more difficult, if not impossible. So our priority right now is really to make this diplomacy robust and to get the civilian-led government in place.
Okay. Mr. Day, any comments on laundering? Okay. With that, I yield my time.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me just ask a couple of final questions. On December 28th, the New York Times, in an article on the front lines of the Saudi war in Yemen, child soldiers from Darfur, the point was made that on any given time, for nearly 4 years, there were some 14,000 Sudanese militia, mostly from Darfur, who really comprise the RSF. So child soldiers are deployed. They take part in that battle, then some, I guess, maybe many are returned. Is that what we're talking about in terms of the composition of those 50,000 RSF forces? Are we talking about child soldiers who are growing older, of course, but more battle-hardened, who have now turned their violence against Sudanese people? And again, if I could ask, do we have any sense of as to how much money from the Gulf states is flowing to this transitional government? And will the Saudis and others do more to just put a tourniquet on the money and their diplomatic support for this terrible bloodletting? And again, thirdly and finally, does USAID have enough resources? I mean, we're talking millions of people again. Is there a need for an urgent supplemental, or is money being diverted from some other account to ensure that food, clothing, medicine, and shelter is provided for the victims?
With respect to the child soldier issue, I would note that Sudan has recently been relisted under the Child Soldier Protection Act, which has consequences with it. It has sanctions attached to it. But of course, as they're already under SST sanctions, it doesn't trigger any new financial issues, but it is something that we will take note of, and the civilian government will have to address that. So they are relisted for the reasons you described. I would say that some of those comprise some of the RSF forces. I couldn't give you a breakdown, a real number. But we know that there have been forces deployed to Yemen, and that we have been concerned about that, and we've raised that.
Do we have any idea of what their cycling is? I mean, we all worry here, even in the United States, the UK, others, that when people were deployed, went to fight with ISIS, when they came back, posed a very real threat to the U.S. or name the country. Are these soldiers, upon their return, now obviously better trained in really barbaric behavior? Are they then, I mean, how many are we talking about, and are they disciplined? I mean, who are they?
I actually don't have a firm answer for what happens to the returnees. We can come back to it.
Could you provide that for the record?
But I would also like to answer your question about the money from the Gulf states.
Yes.
What we have been told repeatedly, we've had several interventions on this issue, the Saudis and the UAE government pledged a total of $3 billion over a 2-year time frame. They have indicated to us that they've each deposited $250 million into the Central Bank of Sudan, and that money is there to stabilize the pound, and it was not given to the TMC, and it's not against the people of Sudan, but it was to avoid a crisis, a fire as they described it. We have made the strong case to them that any additional disbursements of those funds should be done in coordination with the international community, one, to make it more effective and sustainable, and to use it to help a civilian-led government, which will need that assistance over time. So they seem to be responsive to those entreaties, and we hope that that's how they will disperse the remainder of that $3 billion.
Ranking Member Smith, I think on the issue of do we have enough resources, given the increasing need as well as the access issues, the humanitarian operations are fully functional. And so areas in which we can gain access, we have the resources that we need to address many of those issues. As the situation evolves, We may have to reassess as we go forward, because it was only a year and a half ago that we were at about 4.5 million in need of humanitarian assistance, and now we're at 8 million. So this is an extremely fluid situation. So we'll continue to watch this. We are also looking at other ways in which we may be able to support many of the people of South Sudan. We're looking at Office of Transition Initiatives programming. We're looking at ways in which we can continue to monitor the human rights issues. So there's a wide range of tools that we're using. But on the humanitarian assistance side, we're deploying the resources that we have available to us, but many of the restrictions are going to be more on the access side than they are the resources there. We can move resources from one place to another.
And before I run out of time, is there any serious consideration at the UN of redeploying or in some way constituting a force? I know it takes a long time to do all of that, but you know, my sense is that I don't have a great deal of optimism that peace is going to break out. So one of the contingencies should be, will there be a UN force ready for deployment?
To my knowledge, the UN Security Council has not taken this issue up yet, but the UN does have an envoy, a very capable envoy, Frank Haysom, who's been fully engaged in all the conversations with the other envoys, with the TMC, with the FFC. He's been in Khartoum quite a bit. He's engaged with us. We think the UN is clearly poised to take action, but it has not come to the Security Council. If I can add one other point that I didn't mention earlier, June 30th is close approaching. We're very concerned about the potential violence for June 30th. We have also been conveying very strong messages to the TMC that they must allow peaceful protests, that if there's any repeat of the violence that we saw on June 3rd, that there will be consequences, and that the people have a right to protest, because we are anticipating that there will be major activities on the day of June 30th.
And you think Hamedi gets that?
Well, we've been conveying that across the board. Certainly we've been conveying it to Burhan and to others. We think that message is being repeatedly delivered by other partners as well. It's not just our message, it's the collective UN and international message.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your work under such difficult circumstances.
Sure, my pleasure. Just have a couple of final questions. I wanted to know if the U.S. is encouraging the TMC to turn al-Bashir over to the ICC.
That hasn't been a topic of recent conversation. As you've seen probably in the media, he's had a hearing at the court in Khartoum.
Yes.
And I think that's where he stands right now. He's incarcerated in Khartoum, but there has not been an engagement on the ICC issue.
I wanted to know if you know of where the Speaker of the Parliament is. The Speaker that was in place last year, I don't know if there's a new Speaker, and other parliamentary leaders before the Bashir's removal. Are they still in place, or is Parliament not functioning at all?
My sense is that Parliament is not functioning, and there's certainly been a lot of people who have been removed from the office. I couldn't say the status of the Speaker per se. I really don't know that, and I'll do some checking. But
Could you find out for me?
Yes.
I would like to know where he is.
Thank you.
And Madam Chair, on that front, I would just add that on the public administration side, because of course USAID worked closely with the Humanitarian Aid Commission, many of those institutions have in many ways been either dismantled or completely sidelined. In some cases, the National Intelligence and Security Services have actually been, they were interfering in our ability to work with the HAC to get the permits that we needed. In an odd chain of events, the inability or the distraction of the NIST has actually enabled some of that permitting process to actually improve. It's still complicated in terms of the humanitarian access in certain areas, but in many cases, our interactions with the government of Sudan has been almost non-existent.
Thank you. The internet blackout, I just want to say in closing, the internet blackout we know is affecting most of the country's citizens and has now been turned off for what I believe is 21 days. Internet access, we believe, must be reinstated, and I urge those behind this to unblock internet access immediately. Governments must understand that prohibiting access does not mean that citizens will stop exercising their civil rights. I urge the government also to stop the censoring of print newspapers and stop detaining and harassing journalists, activists, and any citizen exercising their right to free speech and protest peacefully. Members of Congress from both sides of the aisle are very engaged in Sudan and plan to continue to do that. And we want to make sure that we have a strong, unified message to help the citizens of Sudan realize their goal of a civilian-led transition to power. As I mentioned when we started, this is a first hearing. This is not our last. I would appreciate it if you would pass the word to Ambassador Booth and Naj that we would like to have them come and speak to us, and we would like to do that very soon. When we have another hearing on Sudan, we will make sure that we have more than one panel, and there will be Sudanese who are represented in the future. I apologize we weren't able to do that this time, but assure you that this is not the last time that you will hear from us on this issue. Members of Congress, as I said, are very, very concerned about this and do not plan to let up. With that, this hearing is adjourned.